When people think of traditional quilts, they usually think of patchwork. But one of the most prevalent styles that's been made in the UK for several hundred years contains no patchwork at all. These are wholecloth quilts. When we talk about wholecloth quilts, sometimes people expect the top of the quilt to just be made of one piece of fabric. It's not quite that simple, because until the early 20th century it wasn't possible to weave wider pieces of fabric. The common width was 28 inches. So in fact, if you look closely, you can see the seam lines that are here, and the quilt is in fact made from 3 strips joined together. One here, and one here, and one here. The 3 strips works better than 2 strips in any case, because the central motif, which has the most elaborate quilting, you don't really want a seam line going through the middle of it.
What type of fabrics were used for wholecloth quilts? Well, unless you were wealthy enough to afford silk, the alternatives were wool or occasionally linen. Particularly in Wales, where there were many small mills producing wool flannel fabric from local sheep, this continued as a popular choice for warm quilts throughout most of the 19th century. It was usually dyed in strong colours, such as the red here, obtained by dyeing with madder. The russet colour on the other side is the result of using a mordant as well. However, with the Industrial Revolution came a plentiful supply of cheap cotton fabric, and this quickly found its way into quilts. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, cotton sateen became a very popular choice for wholecloth quilts, as the slight sheen caught the light and revealed the texture of the quilting patterns very well. Both sides of a wholecloth quilt could be the same colour. For a best quilt, white was often chosen, but other popular choices were pastel colours, pink, yellow, blue and green. With the introduction of the new aniline dyes in the late Victorian period, quite strong colour combinations were possible too. Often a different colour was chosen for each side of the quilt. Some of the colour combinations are surprisingly bold. Wholecloth quilts weren't just made from plain fabrics. Patterned fabrics were used too, often in combination with a plain on one side and a patterned fabric on the other. Patterned fabrics didn't show up the quilting designs as clearly, but were perhaps a little more forgiving at absorbing everyday dirt, and so the plain side was sometimes kept for best and the patterned for everyday. Paisley fabrics were a very popular choice in the beginning of the 20th century, commonly in red, but sometimes here in blue.
I hear wholecloth quilts referred to as Durham quilts, but it's perhaps not the best name, because that sounds as though it's restricted to just the area of County Durham. Many areas of the UK would have produced quilts like this, but the tradition continued the longest in 2 particular areas: Wales, particularly South Wales, and the whole of the northeast of England, which covers not just the county of Durham, but also Northumberland and parts of Yorkshire. Towards the end of the 19th century, differences in styles of the motifs and the way they were arranged started to emerge between the 2 regions. It's possible now to look at a wholecloth quilt, not knowing anything about the provenance, and to make a good guess about where it comes from, just by seeing which motifs were used and how they are arranged in the overall design. Looking at this quilt, for example, it's easy to see that it's a North Country quilt. What are the features that make it identifiable as such? Which motifs are typical? And what are the arrangements that were distinctive of each of these regions? Quilts, of course, were made originally to go on beds, and this determines the overall features of the design. There's usually a central motif, which would have been on the top of the bed, and then the sides of the quilt, where there were 1 or more borders, would hang down over the edge. The actual size of the quilt is usually rectangular, because a bed tends to be longer than it is wide. But of course it depends whether it's a single bed or a double bed that it was made for, and it also depends on how old the quilt is, because bed sizes have changed over the centuries. As is common in North Country quilts, there's a very elaborate motif in the centre, which is made up of a number of different elements. Right at the very centre of this one we have a True Lover's Knot motif, and then surrounding that we have 4 fleur-de-lis motifs in the centre of each side. here and here and here. To the outside of those, we then have some roses at the centre of each side, and in between those there are some pairs of ostrich feathers. These make a nice frame for the central section, and surrounding those are extra little bits of swirls and floral motifs to complete the central area. On North Country quilts, between the central motif and the border, you nearly always find this fine grid. It's usually called square diamonds. This runs straight and blends in with the border. There are no parallel lines, as there are on Welsh quilts, dividing the two areas. This particular quilt has two borders. On the very outside there's a narrow cable, but the main feature are these big fans that are repeated on there. When we get to the corner, we can again see that there's quite an elaborate feature made of several different motifs. Here we've got a big flower, and then we've got two curved feathers coming in to form a spray that moves towards the centre of the quilt. Feathers are a very common feature on North Country quilting. The edge of traditional British quilts is finished not with a binding, but with a butted edge. You can see that both front and the back finish right on the edge here. What happens is that both of them come round and are turned inside, and then the edge is secured with a fine line of stitching very close to the edge. Can you see on here that this one is finished with a machine stitch? This is more common on North Country quilts, whereas Welsh quilts it's more common to find a hand-stitched edge. This is a typical example of a Welsh quilt made in the early years of the 20th century. The typical features include this central area here, where we have a double ring surrounding a central motif. Sometimes this is called a coin for obvious reasons. This particular quilt has large petaled flower in the middle, but it also contains a motif which is the hallmark of Welsh quilting, the spiral. And you find these spirals on many, many Welsh quilts. The central area is surrounded by some borders separated by these double straight lines. And these lines separate not only the centre from the first border, but then this border from the other borders as well. This structure, where we have the parallel lines, not only vertically but horizontally separating the different areas of the quilt from each other, was found in most British quilts in the early years, but towards the end of the 19th century North Country quilts gradually dropped it, but Welsh quilts retained the feature, and so if you see that on a later quilt, it's again a good clue that it comes from Wales. The inner border contains a motif which is again another one commonly found on Welsh quilts, the paisley, sometimes called the pear. Here it is. And we've got a series of them next to each other that make the inner border. The paisley, of course, has its origins in Indian textiles which were brought over and imported into this country in the 17th century, and it was adopted widely and used on British textiles too.
Quilters had to produce their own templates and drew them out in the various sizes needed. Each had their own particular style that they preferred, so these paisley motifs on different quilts, for example, are not the same. A variety of leaves can also be found on Welsh quilts. This one is just known as the bent leaf, but others are distinctly recognisable, such as this beech leaf. Which other motifs were likely to be found on Welsh quilts? Hearts were always popular, filled with various different fillings, and fans too, which were often located in the corners of the central section next to the coin.
The outer border of this quilt is made up of a series of sections all distributed evenly about the centre point. We have one with the two big spirals and some little spirals. We also have a motif with 4 leaves, both here and at the corner. Leaves are another common motif in Welsh quilts. At the centre there's a little flower, and if you study the quilt carefully you can see that this is how the quilter has managed to make the borders of different sizes to go with a rectangular finished size. This flower is quite narrow, but if you look down at the side, the corresponding one here is much wider, and that's how she's made the side borders longer than the top and bottom. You'll notice that on this quilt we've got a really deep texture. That's common on Welsh quilts because the wadding is comparatively thick compared to on North Country quilts. Sometimes it's wool, sometimes it's cotton. And if we look at the edge is the same as on the North Country quilt with one difference. This edge again is butted but is finished with a layer of hand stitching, not machine stitching. Quilt history study is always aided if there's some information about the provenance of a quilt. Where it was made, who it was made by, when it was made, who it was made for. Because I bought this from the granddaughter of the couple James and Catherine Hall, who received it as a wedding present in February 1902, I know some of its background. Catherine came from a family of farm labourers in Stamfordham, which is a village to the west of Newcastle, and her new husband James was a general carter who went on to work with pit ponies. I'm surprised that people from a relatively humble background were given such a beautiful quilt. The quality of the stitching and design marks this out as the work of a professional. You can see in this close-up the quality of the stitching. It really is very fine and even on this running feather. It's helped by the fact that the cotton wadding which is used in this quilt is very thin, and thinner wadding generally is typical of North Country quilts, whereas Welsh quilts often have it thicker and hence larger stitches. Comparing the North Country quilt to the Welsh quilt, you can see the difference in the thickness of the wadding and how this affects the depth of the quilting that you get. On the Welsh quilt here, the texture is so much deeper and this is flatter. One of the consequences is that the finer stitching is possible on the North Country quilt through the thinner wadding. But it doesn't matter that the stitching is bigger on the Welsh one because you get the compensation of the superb texture. The overall design of this quilt shows a transition. In the northeast of England, George Gardner developed a slightly different style, moving gradually away from the delineated areas that we still see in the Welsh quilts. He developed a more free-flowing style, which is starting to appear in the design of this quilt here. The central design flows through to the square diamonds and then does flow through to the running feather here. But you can see that we still do have the retaining lines dividing the centre section off from the outer border. The large central motif on here has at its heart a very small flower and then what look like large petals round the outside. Each one of these is based on what's sometimes known as a flat iron shape and is an example of how household objects were used as templates to draw around. This particular one is 4-lined and has a leaf motif in the centre. It also has little tiny feathers all around each edge. The inner border shows one of the most typical North Country features, the running feather. We've got this graceful curve that runs along and then down the side. Notice how this quilter, like many, does not try to make the running feather turn the corner. Instead, she uses a swirling flower to fill the gap instead.
Quilters found many inventive ways to combine the feather motifs. If a running feather border was doubled, it became bellows. Feathers could be repeated singly, then they're known as goose wings, or combined together, as here, with other motifs as a wreath. Other designs commonly found on North Country quilts are swags, known as hammocks, flat irons, and roses.
The outer border on this is made up of these large circular motifs with these curved lines that form these motifs here. In the centre we have rings of concentric circles. Notice how beautifully they're spaced so that we get the even number along each side. And on either side of the main border we have a very small little plait that goes nicely round here, divided by those double lines, which is still retaining the...
The many variations on twists, cables and plaits are found in borders of quilts from every region, as are the wineglass pattern formed by overlapping circles. The town of Hawick in the Scottish borders has a design unique to itself, the spiky-centred Hawick heart, which is often combined with either gowans, which is the Scottish word for daisies, or thistles. I hope you've enjoyed discovering more about British wholecloth quilts and that you appreciate their beauty as much as I do. If you'd like to see more examples, then have a look at those in the Quilters Guild collection.